Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and if you're a first-time viewer, my name is Jeff Lanoski. Today's episode is all about bike fit. There's a ton of trends going on in the mountain bike industry. Since mountain biking isn't a one-size-fits-all sport, some of these trends might be good for some riders, they might not be good for others. So I have a few experiments planned today that involve this scale, this whiteboard behind me, and a few other things that will help you demystify some of the terms being thrown around, and I'll help you figure out what's best for your particular riding style and how these geometry changes affect hardtail choice versus suspension. Spoiler alert, they're totally different. If you're new to the channel, please consider hitting that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you can be alerted every time a new video comes out. Let's give a quick overview on some of the terms used to size bikes nowadays and talk about why some of these changes happen. If you go back to early mountain bike days, the two ways that you would size a mountain bike were off of seat tube and off of your top tube. Mountain bikes used to be a pretty traditional diamond design, and the top tubes were real tall. So you needed to make sure that you had enough room to stand over the bike. And then you also wanted to know the distance from your seat tube to your head tube, and that would determine the amount of room that you had when you sat on the bike and pedaled it down the trail. Flash forward a number of years, riders are riding more aggressively, rougher trails than ever before. They started wanting longer travel, they started wanting bigger wheels, and when you have a slack seat tube, long travel, there's not a lot of room for this big giant wheel to move and have room without hitting the frame. So the most common way to size a bike nowadays is based off of reach. Reach is calculated by drawing a vertical line through your cranks and then taking the horizontal measurement from there to the center of your head tube. If you use your reach, your stem length, and your stack, that's the vertical measurement from the top of your head tube to your cranks. If you combine those three things, that's your cockpit length. Those three numbers will have a pretty big effect on how the bike feels when you're riding down the trail, whether you're sitting or standing and riding technical terrain or going super fast. There's some of the terminology. Now let's head out on the trail and see how this stuff affects you in the real world. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons of a real steep seat angle and a long reach versus a short reach. The number one benefit for a bike with a steep seat tube and a long reach is its ability to climb. You sit in a much more centered position on the bike, and the days of sitting on the nose of the saddle, hunching over the bars are gone. As riders started going faster and faster, steer tube angles started slacking out a lot, which put the front wheel much further in front of you. And when you came into a turn, it was real easy to push the front wheel because you didn't have as much weight on it as you used to. So having a longer reach puts more weight on the front tire and allows you to get that traction that you need. Just like anything, every design is gonna have pros and it's gonna have cons. So let's talk about what I perceive to be some of the main negative points of long reach bikes. First off, if you live somewhere where trails are really tight and twisty, a long reach bike is just going to be a bigger bike and it's going to be more of a handful to take through those trails. So you're going to want to give some consideration onto how long you want your bike to be. The second thing is something that I hold near and dear to my heart, and that's the ability to bunny hop a bicycle. When the reach is too long, the bike could be really hard to bunny hop. And the last negative thing about a long reach bike, similar to riding single track, it's a longer bike, so doing little jibs and doing 180s and stuff like that is just going to be a little bit more of a handful on a long reach bike because it's just more bike to move around. That's my quick trail overview. Let's head back into the shop and dive into this some more. My choice of full suspension bike pretty much goes right in line with most manufacturers' size charts nowadays, but my hardtail is quite a bit smaller. When I built my hardtail last year, I tried to match all the numbers of my suspension bike to my hardtail. The reach, the stack, I tried to make them all match on paper. And when I got on those bikes, they felt completely different when you got out on the trail and rode them. And it got me thinking, a hardtail is a rigid frame that behaves one way, and a suspension bike is a dynamic piece of equipment with pivot points that move everything around, and it behaves completely different. So I'm gonna use this whiteboard behind me to demonstrate just how that happens. If you ever take a video of yourself right before you're leaving the face of a jump, or you're doing a bunny hop, you'll notice that your bottom bracket's quite a bit lower and your hands come in towards you. On a hardtail, that doesn't happen. So let's take a look and see how much this changes. All right, so I'm gonna put this marker on top of my grip. The center point of the handlebar would actually be through the center of it, not on top of it, but the marker. But I'm gonna sit on it So you can see just by me sitting on it, my handlebars come down and back close to 20 millimeters. That's just with me sitting on it with a proper preload. I'm gonna try to do a seat bounce now and see if I can get it to go even further. So you can see before you're gonna preload a jump or do a bunny hop, you're bringing in your reach quite a bit. This is a pretty big distance from here to here. Now, you definitely have front travel compression, but on a suspension bike, when you do that, the bike usually goes down with the rear suspension and the front suspension together. Or even on a downhill, you're definitely sagging in your rear suspension and your front suspension. So these measurements stay a lot more consistent. Now I'm gonna grab my hardtail and show you the difference between the suspension bike and the hardtail, and why a hardtail will always ride, which means feel, longer than a suspension bike. Now it's time for me to do the same experiment on my hardtail. I'm gonna take the marker, I'm gonna put it on top of my grip, I'm gonna lean it against the wall, and I'm gonna compress my rear suspension. It didn't move.
Oh yeah.
So that's the center point of my handlebars, and it doesn't move when you sit on it. But the thing I can do is compress the front suspension, and let's take a look at what happens when you do that. Well, it went from here to here. So I kind of poked through right there, but you can see it arcs from here to here, and that's about the same distance as the other bike shortens. This bike lengthens. So that was actually a pretty interesting experiment for myself, because I saw that my hardtail has the ability to get as long as my suspension bike has to get short. So let's talk about my personal bikes. Like I mentioned earlier, my suspension bike has a reach of 505. My old hardtail that I rode last year had a reach of 485, and it still felt too long, which it was 20 millimeters shorter on paper. This year I went to a 465. Looking at these diagrams that I just made on the wall right here totally makes sense, because my suspension bike has the ability to shorten 20 millimeters, and my hardtail has the ability to lengthen 20 millimeters. And that's why when I get on my hardtail, it almost feels as similar as my suspension bike. Ready for another experiment? I said I had a scale for something. Let me show you what that one was all about. I'm gonna keep my bike in the bike stand. I'm gonna put my front wheel on the scale, and I wanna see the difference between this year's hardtail and last year's hardtail, how much weight it applies to the front tire in a normal riding position. Let's see if there's any science behind what I was thinking. I'm gonna balance on my bike, we'll take a measurement, we'll swap bikes, see if there's a difference. I'm not gonna look at the number because I don't wanna influence it, so my tire's blocking it, I can't see what it is. All right, I'm in my normal riding position, head up. We'll get a measurement for that one, and then let's swap bikes and see what the other one says. Normal, ready position, and let's see what that one is. That's a pretty big difference, almost 5 pounds. It makes sense that with my new bike, I was able to run the front fork softer, giving me better traction when I ride. We talked about bike geometry, we did some experiments, and I showed you how sizing for a suspension bike is gonna be completely different than a hardtail. So where does that leave us? Size charts for bikes are pretty useful, but another great way to figure out what size bike is gonna be good for you is to use your rad measurement. And if you go to a YouTube channel that I'll link below called Joya Bike, they've just done a couple videos on figuring out your rad measurement. And it's basically your cockpit on your bike. My suspension bike falls right within the guidelines of what they're telling you. And I think it's a great way to measure bike. For hardtails, my bike is quite a bit shorter, and I think these experiments showed you why. As I said in the intro, mountain biking is not a one-size-fits-all sport. If you're looking to ride wide open trails and go as fast as possible, those longer bikes are gonna give you a ton of stability, and they'll probably work out awesome for you. But if you're an East Coaster like myself and you wanna ride more tight technical trails, do lots of jibbing and stuff like that, and when you take into consideration that a hardtail only gets longer as you ride it, it's always better to lean on the side of a slightly smaller bike. So there you have it. This video was a ton of fun to make. Hopefully you enjoyed watching it as much as I've enjoyed making it. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. Next week, we'll be out riding some new trails. So until next time, get out there and be a boss.